On the evening of March 14, 1978, inside a secure fourth-floor office at the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C., a 26-year-old signals analyst named Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov sat alone at his desk, reviewing intercepted communications that had come through the embassy's listening station earlier that day. The room was small, windowless, and perpetually cold, the kind of space that seemed designed to remind its occupant that they existed only to serve a larger machine. Petrov had been stationed in Washington for 11 months, a junior member of the GRU's Signals Intelligence Directorate, tasked with monitoring American military communications and identifying patterns that might indicate shifts in U.S. strategic posture. It was tedious work, the kind that required both technical precision and interpretive judgment, and on that particular evening, Petrov was exhausted. He had been on duty since 6 that morning, covering for a colleague who had fallen ill, and the combination of fatigue and the monotony of the task had begun to erode his concentration. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would nearly trigger a catastrophic miscalculation between the two nuclear superpowers, destroy Petrov's life, and ultimately expose the fragility of the systems designed to prevent global annihilation. The communication Petrov was analyzing had originated from a U.S. Air Force base in Nebraska, part of the routine chatter that flowed constantly between American military installations. Under normal circumstances, these transmissions were mundane, filled with logistics updates, maintenance schedules, and administrative directives. But Petrov, working from a codebook that had been updated only days earlier, misinterpreted a series of abbreviations in one particular message. The transmission referenced an exercise designated Pale Horse 7, a phrase that appeared nowhere in Petrov's reference materials. In his fatigued state, and operating under the constant pressure to identify threats before they materialized, Petrov made a critical error in judgment. He cross-referenced the phrase against a separate document that outlined known U.S. contingency plans for nuclear operations, and he found what he believed to be a match. The problem was that Petrov had confused two entirely different classification systems. Pale Horse 7 was actually a logistics code for a routine bomber training exercise scheduled to begin the following week. But Petrov, seeing the word Pale Horse and connecting it to a Cold War-era U.S. strategic plan that used similar apocalyptic nomenclature, convinced himself that what he was looking at was preliminary communication for a first strike scenario. At approximately 9:45 that evening, Petrov filed his report. He walked it directly to the office of Major General Dmitry Ivanovich Sokolov, the GRU resident, who oversaw all military intelligence operations at the embassy. Sokolov was a veteran of Soviet intelligence, a man who had spent the previous 2 decades navigating the paranoia and bureaucratic treachery of the KGB and GRU apparatus, and he understood that in the world they inhabited, caution was not merely prudent, but essential to survival. When Petrov presented his analysis, Sokolov read it carefully, his expression revealing nothing. The document was concise, technical, and alarming. Petrov had written that he had identified communication patterns consistent with the preliminary phase of a U.S. nuclear strike, that the timing suggested an operation could be imminent, and that further monitoring was urgently required. Sokolov asked Petrov several questions about his methodology, about the sources of his interpretation, and about his confidence level. Petrov, believing fully in his analysis and terrified of understating a potential threat, responded with certainty. He was sure, he said, that what he had intercepted warranted immediate escalation. Sokolov made a decision that would prove catastrophic. Rather than consulting with other analysts or seeking independent verification, he took Petrov's report directly to Ambassador Yevgeny Konstantinovich Belousov, the senior Soviet diplomat in Washington and the ultimate authority within the embassy. Belousov was not an intelligence professional. He was a party loyalist, a man whose career had been built on ideological orthodoxy rather than operational expertise, and he was deeply aware that his position depended on his ability to demonstrate vigilance against American aggression. When Sokolov presented Petrov's findings, framing them as credible and time-sensitive, Belousov responded with alarm. He immediately convened an emergency meeting with the embassy's senior leadership, including the KGB station chief and the heads of the political and military attaché offices. The meeting took place just after 11 that night, in a secure conference room in the embassy's basement, a space designed to be impervious to electronic surveillance. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the weight of what was being discussed. Belousov opened the meeting by stating that they had received intelligence suggesting that the United States might be preparing a first strike against the Soviet Union, that the source was a signals intercept analyzed by a GRU officer, and that the information required immediate action. The response from the assembled officials was mixed. The KGB station chief, a man named Arkady Filipovich Gromov, expressed skepticism. He pointed out that there had been no corroborating intelligence from other sources, no unusual activity detected by KGB surveillance of American military installations, and no indication from Soviet intelligence networks inside the US government that anything out of the ordinary was occurring. Gromov suggested that the intercept might be part of routine military exercises, that it could have been misinterpreted, and that escalating the matter to Moscow without further verification was premature. But Belousov, either unwilling to risk being seen as negligent or genuinely convinced by the urgency of Sokolov's presentation, overruled him. He argued that the cost of inaction, if the intelligence proved accurate, was unthinkable, and that the embassy had a duty to report the threat to Moscow immediately and to take precautionary measures. Sokolov, who by this point had staked his credibility on Petrov's analysis, supported the ambassador's position. The decision was made. They would report the threat to the Kremlin and, in anticipation of a potential American attack, they would begin destroying sensitive materials to prevent them from falling into enemy hands in the event that the embassy was seized or compromised. At 12:30 in the morning on March 15th, the embassy's secure communications room transmitted an encrypted cable to Moscow, marked with the highest priority classification. The message stated that the Washington Residentura had intercepted communications indicating that the United States was preparing a nuclear first strike, that the timing suggested the operation could be executed within days, and that the embassy was taking emergency measures to safeguard intelligence assets. The cable was received at the GRU headquarters in Moscow just after 8 in the morning, local time, and it triggered immediate panic. The message was forwarded to the Soviet General Staff, to the KGB's First Chief Directorate, and directly to the office of the Soviet Defense Minister. Within an hour, the Kremlin had convened an emergency session of the Defense Council, a body that included the General Secretary, the Defense Minister, the Foreign Minister, and the heads of the KGB and GRU. The Council met in a secure facility beneath the Kremlin, and the discussion was fraught with tension. The Soviet Union, in 1978, was at the height of its Cold War confrontation with the United States, and the leadership in Moscow operated under a constant assumption that the Americans were seeking an opportunity to destroy the Soviet state. The intelligence from Washington, vague and unverified as it was, fit perfectly into this worldview. But even as the Defense Council debated whether to place Soviet nuclear forces on alert, there were voices of caution. The head of the GRU, General Pyotr Ivanovich Ivashutin, pointed out that the intelligence was based on a single intercept, that it had not been corroborated by other sources, and that there were no other indicators of an imminent American attack. He suggested that the embassy in Washington might have overreacted, that the information might be incomplete or misinterpreted, and that placing Soviet forces on alert without more concrete evidence risked provoking exactly the kind of crisis they were trying to avoid. But the defense minister, Dmitry Ustinov, was less cautious. He argued that the Soviet Union could not afford to wait for confirmation if the Americans were indeed preparing a first strike, that the consequences of being caught unprepared were existential, and that the embassy's report had to be taken seriously. The General Secretary, Leonid Brezhnev, who by 1978 was in declining health and increasingly reliant on his advisors, sided with Ustinov. He ordered that Soviet strategic forces be placed on heightened alert, that additional intelligence assets be mobilized to confirm or refute the Washington report, and that the embassy be instructed to continue its precautionary measures. Back in Washington, the embassy had already begun the process of destruction. Starting just after 1 in the morning on March 15th, teams of embassy personnel, working under the supervision of Sokolov and Gromov, began systematically burning documents in the embassy's secure incinerators. The operation was methodical and exhaustive. First to be destroyed were the most sensitive intelligence files, the records of Soviet agents operating inside the U.S. government, military, and defense industry, the communications intercepts that had been collected over years, the assessments of American strategic capabilities, and the operational plans for Soviet intelligence activities in North America. These were documents that represented decades of work, intelligence that had been painstakingly gathered through infiltration, surveillance, bribery, and blackmail, and their loss would represent a devastating blow to Soviet intelligence capabilities. But in the early hours of March 15th, as the fires burned in the embassy's basement and the acrid smell of burning paper filled the ventilation system, no one questioned the decision. They believed, because they had been told, that the United States was preparing to attack, and that the preservation of these materials was secondary to preventing them from being captured. By dawn, the operation had consumed nearly every classified document in the embassy's possession. The intelligence officers worked in shifts, feeding papers into the incinerators, checking manifests to ensure that nothing was overlooked, and documenting the destruction in accordance with Soviet protocol. Petrov, the analyst whose report had triggered the crisis, was not directly involved in the burning. He remained at his desk, continuing to monitor American communications, searching desperately for further evidence that would confirm his initial assessment. But as the hours passed, he found nothing. The American military traffic continued as it always had, routine and unremarkable, with no indication of unusual activity. By mid-morning, Petrov began to feel the first stirrings of doubt. He reviewed his original analysis, retraced his interpretation of the intercept, and slowly began to realize that he might have made a mistake. The phrase, "Pale Horse 7", which had seemed so ominous the night before, no longer fit the pattern he had assumed. He pulled out the updated codebook again, cross-referenced it with older materials, and discovered his error. The logistics code he had misidentified had nothing to do with nuclear operations. It was simply a designation for a training exercise. Petrov sat frozen at his desk, the weight of his realization crushing him. He understood immediately what he had done, and he understood the consequences. The Soviet system did not tolerate errors of this magnitude, and the fact that his mistake had been made in good faith, under conditions of exhaustion and pressure, would be irrelevant. He considered for a brief moment, saying nothing, hoping that the error would somehow resolve itself or be obscured by the chaos of the response. But he knew that was impossible. The embassy had already reported the threat to Moscow, and the Kremlin had almost certainly taken action based on that report. If he remained silent, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for him, but for millions of people. At approximately 11 in the morning, Petrov walked to Sokolov's office and requested an urgent meeting. Sokolov, who had been awake for more than 30 hours and was coordinating the final stages of the document destruction, was irritated by the interruption. But when Petrov explained that he needed to revise his assessment, Sokolov's irritation turned to cold fury. He demanded that Petrov explain himself, and as the young analyst walked through his realization, detailing the error in his interpretation and the confusion between the two classification systems, Sokolov's expression became unreadable. The general did not respond immediately. He sat in silence, staring at Petrov, and then he stood and ordered the analyst to remain in his office. Sokolov walked directly to Ambassador Belousov's office and informed him of the development. Belousov, in turn, convened another emergency meeting, this time with a much smaller group, just himself, Sokolov, and Gromov. The three men discussed their options, and the conversation was grim. They had already reported a potential American first strike to Moscow, had already destroyed years of intelligence work, and had already set in motion a response that could include the mobilization of Soviet nuclear forces. And now they were being told that the entire crisis had been triggered by a junior analyst's misinterpretation of a routine training exercise. The political and professional consequences for everyone involved were unthinkable. Belousov made the decision to report the error to Moscow immediately, but to frame it in a way that minimized the appearance of incompetence. The cable that was sent to the Kremlin later that afternoon stated that further analysis had determined that the initial intelligence assessment had been based on incomplete information, that subsequent monitoring had found no corroborating evidence of an American first strike, and that the threat level had been downgraded. The cable did not explicitly state that the original report had been wrong, nor did it acknowledge that the embassy had destroyed its intelligence archives based on a faulty analysis. The response from Moscow came within hours, and it was scathing. The Defense Council, which had spent the previous day debating whether to place Soviet nuclear forces on full alert, was furious. General Ivashutin, who had urged caution from the beginning, sent a message directly to Sokolov demanding a full accounting of how the intelligence had been generated and why it had been reported with such certainty. The KGB's first chief directorate launched its own inquiry, and within days, investigators from both agencies arrived in Washington to conduct interviews and review the embassy's procedures. The inquiry was swift and brutal. Petrov was interrogated repeatedly, his methodology dissected, his training records examined, and his character assessed. Sokolov and Belousov were questioned about their decision-making process, about why they had escalated the report without independent verification, and about why they had ordered the destruction of the embassy's archives before confirming the threat. The investigators' conclusions were damning. They determined that Petrov had made a catastrophic error due to inadequate training, fatigue, and overconfidence, that Sokolov had failed to exercise proper oversight, and that Belousov had acted recklessly in ordering the destruction of materials without sufficient cause. But the most severe judgment was reserved for Petrov, because in the Soviet system, individual culpability was always the most convenient explanation. By early April, the decision had been made. Petrov would be recalled to Moscow, and he would face consequences for his error. On April 18, 1978, Viktor Petrov was placed on a direct Aeroflot flight from Washington to Moscow, accompanied by two GRU security officers. He was not permitted to speak to anyone before his departure, and he was not allowed to contact his family. His wife Irina and their two young children, who had been living with him in a modest apartment in the Virginia suburbs, were informed only that Victor was being reassigned for urgent reasons and that they would be following him back to the Soviet Union within weeks. Irina, who had grown accustomed to the secrecy and sudden disruptions of intelligence work, accepted the explanation without question. She packed their belongings, made arrangements to close their apartment, and prepared for the journey home. But when she and the children arrived in Moscow in early May, they were met not by Victor, but by two officers from the GRU's Internal Security Directorate. They were taken to a small office in a building near Lubyanka Square, and there they were told that Victor had been convicted of gross negligence in the performance of his duties, that he had been sentenced to life imprisonment, and that they would not be permitted to see him or communicate with him. Irina's shock was absolute. She demanded to know what Victor had done, where he was being held, and whether she could appeal the sentence. The officers provided no details. They told her only that the matter was classified, that the decision was final, and that any further inquiries would be considered evidence of disloyalty. Irina was given a small state pension, enough to survive but not to live comfortably, and she and her children were relocated to a communal apartment in a Moscow suburb. Over the following months, she made repeated attempts to learn more about Victor's fate, writing letters to the GRU, to the Ministry of Defense, and even to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Every letter went unanswered. Eventually, a neighbor, a woman whose own husband had disappeared during the purges of the 1950s, advised her to stop asking questions. Some things, the woman said, were not meant to be known. What Irina did not know, and what she would never learn, was that Viktor Petrov had not been imprisoned. The story of a life sentence was a lie, a bureaucratic fiction designed to provide his family with a plausible narrative while concealing the truth. In reality, Petrov had been executed within days of his arrival in Moscow. The decision had been made at the highest levels of the GRU, with the tacit approval of the KGB and the Defense Council. The logic was simple and brutal. Petrov's error had nearly provoked a nuclear confrontation, had resulted in the loss of irreplaceable intelligence, and had embarrassed the Soviet Union in the eyes of its own leadership. His execution served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that the Soviet system would not tolerate incompetence. It provided a scapegoat for the failures of the embassy leadership, and it ensured that Petrov could never speak publicly about what had happened. On the morning of April 26, 1978, in a basement facility at Lefortovo prison, Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov was shot once in the back of the head. His body was cremated, and his ashes were disposed of without ceremony. No record of his execution was entered into any official registry, and his name was quietly removed from all GRU personnel files. The broader consequences of the incident were felt for years. The Soviet embassy in Washington spent the next decade attempting to rebuild its intelligence networks, a process that was slow, expensive, and incomplete. The loss of the files that had been burned in March 1978 represented a setback that would take an entire generation to overcome. Many of the agents whose identities had been documented in those files were never successfully recontacted, and the intelligence gaps that resulted left the Soviet Union operating partially blind during some of the most critical years of the Cold War. Within the Soviet intelligence community, the episode became a cautionary tale, whispered about in secure facilities but never officially acknowledged. It was referred to obliquely as the Washington mistake or the March event, and it served as a reminder of how quickly fear and institutional pressure could distort judgment. In the United States, there was no awareness of how close the world had come to disaster. American intelligence agencies detected the heightened alert status of Soviet forces in mid-March 1978, but they attributed it to routine military exercises and never connected it to Petrov's error. The US government remained entirely unaware that a junior Soviet analyst's misinterpretation of a training exercise had nearly triggered a nuclear crisis. The story of what happened inside the Soviet embassy in Washington on March 14th and 15th, 1978, did not become public until more than a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the late 1990s, as Russian archives were briefly opened and former intelligence officers began publishing memoirs, fragments of the incident began to emerge. A retired GRU officer mentioned it in passing in a book about Cold War intelligence failures, describing it as an example of how bureaucratic pressure and fear of punishment could lead to catastrophic errors. A former KGB station chief in Washington confirmed in an interview that the embassy had destroyed its files in the late 1970s due to a false alarm, though he did not provide details about the cause. And in 2003, a Russian journalist investigating Soviet-era executions uncovered Petrov's name in a list of GRU personnel who had been executed for treason or gross negligence. The journalist attempted to locate Petrov's family, but by that time, Irina had passed away, and Petrov's children, now adults, had changed their names and were living under different identities, unwilling to revisit the past. The episode raises questions that remain relevant today. Questions about the human dimension of nuclear decision-making, about the vulnerability of systems that rely on individual judgment under pressure, and about the consequences of cultures that punish error more harshly than they reward caution. Viktor Petrov was not a traitor, and he was not malicious. He was a young man working in an environment of extreme stress, tasked with interpreting fragmentary information and operating under a system that demanded certainty even when certainty was impossible. His error was understandable, the kind of mistake that any analyst in any country under similar conditions might have made. But the system he served was not designed to tolerate mistakes, and the cost of his error was not merely professional, but existential. The destruction of the embassy's intelligence files was a direct result of a culture that prioritized the appearance of action over the careful evaluation of evidence, a culture in which being wrong was more dangerous than being reckless. What makes the story particularly chilling is how easily it could have escalated further. If the Soviet Defense Council had decided to place nuclear forces on full alert, if American intelligence had detected that mobilization and interpreted it as preparation for a Soviet first strike, if the US had responded by raising its own alert status, the spiral toward confrontation could have become unstoppable. The mechanisms that prevented that escalation, the voices of caution in Moscow, the lack of corroborating evidence, the eventual recognition of the error, were fragile and contingent. They depended on individuals making the right decisions under enormous pressure and on systems that, despite their flaws, retained enough skepticism to question alarming intelligence. The world was fortunate that those mechanisms held, but the incident serves as a reminder that the architecture of nuclear deterrence, for all its sophistication and redundancy, ultimately rests on human judgment, and human judgment is fallible. The fate of Viktor Petrov, executed in secret and erased from history, is a testament to the cruelty of a system that valued control over truth. His family was told he was imprisoned, a lie designed to spare them the stigma of execution while preventing them from seeking justice or closure. Irina spent the rest of her life believing that her husband was alive somewhere, locked away in a labor camp. and she never stopped hoping that she might one day see him again. Her children grew up with the knowledge that their father had been taken from them for reasons they could not understand, and they carried that absence with them into adulthood, a wound that never fully healed. The Soviet state, in its zeal to punish incompetence and protect its secrets, destroyed not just Viktor Petrov, but the lives of everyone connected to him. And it did so not because he had betrayed his country, but because he had made a mistake. In the decades since, historians and intelligence analysts have studied the incident as a case study in organizational failure, in the dangers of hierarchical systems that discourage dissent, and in the psychological pressures that can distort perception. Some have argued that the real culpability lay not with Petrov, but with Sokolov and Belousov, the senior officials who escalated his report without verification and who ordered the destruction of the archives without confirming the threat. Others have pointed to the broader culture of the Soviet intelligence apparatus, a culture that rewarded paranoia and punished caution, that prioritized loyalty over accuracy, and that created an environment in which junior analysts like Petrov felt compelled to report threats even when the evidence was ambiguous. Still others have noted that the American military's use of obscure and frequently changing code designations contributed to the confusion, that the lack of transparency between the superpowers created opportunities for misinterpretation, and that the entire Cold War system was built on assumptions and protocols that were inherently fragile. What is undeniable is that the incident exposed the profound risks embedded in the Cold War's architecture of deterrence. The nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union was predicated on the assumption that both sides would act rationally, that they would interpret each other's actions accurately, and that they would avoid escalation even in moments of crisis. But the events of March 1978 demonstrated that rationality was not guaranteed, that interpretation was vulnerable to error, and that escalation could begin not from deliberate aggression, but from simple human mistake. The Soviet embassy in Washington burned its files not because the United States was attacking, but because one tired analyst misread a training exercise, and because the officials above him chose to believe the worst rather than risk being wrong. The consequences of that decision, the loss of intelligence, the execution of a young man, the near miss with nuclear confrontation, were the product not of malice, but of fear. And fear in a nuclear age is as dangerous as any weapon. Today, the building that housed the Soviet embassy in Washington still stands, though it is now the residence of the Russian ambassador, and the diplomatic landscape has changed beyond recognition. The incinerators that burned those files in March 1978 are long gone, replaced by modern document shredding systems and digital encryption. The GRU, which employed Viktor Petrov, was reorganized multiple times after the collapse of the Soviet Union and now operates under different structures and protocols. And the Cold War, with its apocalyptic logic and its ever-present threat of annihilation, is often treated as a historical artifact, a relic of a more dangerous time. But the fundamental dynamics that made the March 1978 incident possible, the reliance on human judgment, the vulnerability to misinterpretation, the organizational pressures that can distort decision-making, remain as relevant today as they were then. The technologies have changed, the political context has evolved, but the human element, with all its fallibility and all its capacity for error, is still at the heart of systems designed to prevent the unthinkable. Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov died alone, believing that he had failed his country, unaware that his execution was itself a greater failure, a betrayal by the very system he had tried to serve. His children never learned the truth about how he died, and his wife went to her grave believing that he was imprisoned somewhere beyond her reach. The intelligence that was burned because of his mistake was never fully recovered, and the Soviet Union's capacity to understand and anticipate American actions was diminished for years as a result. And the world, unknowing and unaware, continued on, spared a catastrophe by the narrowest of margins, by a handful of cautious voices in Moscow, and by the eventual recognition that the threat had been a phantom. The story of that night in March, of the fires that burned in the embassy basement and the young man who triggered them, is a reminder that history is shaped not only by the grand decisions of leaders, but by the small errors of individuals, and that in a world armed with the power to destroy itself, there is no margin for error and no forgiveness for those who fail.